Before we get too far into our advanced theming, we want to take a moment to review some PHP topics that'll aid us in doing the work that we've got ahead of us. For those of you who've worked in PHP a lot or feel comfortable with the language, most of this should be review, but we're going to point out some key things that you'll run into frequently when doing advanced theme work. First, we want to start with PHP data structures. Most simply, we have variables. Variables in PHP are prefixed with a $sign, and all variable names can only have alphanumeric characters, that is, alphabetical letters and numerals, and underscores. There'll be two kinds of main data structures that we'll be using in theming. The first is arrays. Arrays are generally lists that map values to keys. They come in sort of two variations. The first is a simple vector array, which is just a list of values. We've got an example here where we've got a simple array with two elements, stingray and telescope. In a simple vector array, the items are indexed by integers beginning with 0. So in this array, we have indexes of 0 and 1. The other common format of arrays in PHP are hash tables, or associative arrays. These arrays are indexed by strings or other values, not necessarily 0, 1, etc. So in our example here, we have an array of cherries and apple with the indexes of red and green. When working with arrays, we'll frequently want to reference certain items that are part of the array. So in our stingray and telescope array example, if we wanted to print out the first item, we could reference that by using $stuff and then square brackets around the index, such as 0. Printing that value would give us the string stingray. In a hash table example, we use the same method, but using the key string rather than the integer index. So here for our fruit array, if we print fruit and then green in square brackets, we will get the value apple. The other data structure that we'll see frequently in Drupal theming are objects. Objects have properties that are similar to elements of an array. The syntax is slightly different though. To reference an object property, we use the arrow notation, which is created by a dash and an angle bracket. So as you can see here, we have a robot object that has three properties: color, material, and finish. Objects in PHP are similar to arrays, the main difference being that they can have methods or functions associated with them. Primarily in theming, we'll be just concerned with object properties. In a more complex example, something that we may actually run into in Drupal theming, we'll see that we can chain these things together to get quite complicated data structures. So in our first example, we're printing the node links item. So we're starting with, we have a node object in which we're referencing a certain property known as links. Links is actually a two-dimensional array where we have first a key of blog underscore usernames underscore blog, and then within that we have an href key. We can see that value prints out blog/1, which is the URL for an individual user's blog. The next topic we want to cover are conditionals. We'll frequently see these to apply certain display logic, only printing things when certain conditions apply. The most common conditional structure that we'll see is the if-else statements. So our example here reads that if A is equal to B, it'll print its equal. If the values of A and B aren't equal, then it'll check the next conditional, which is the else if A is less than B. So if the value of A is in fact less than B, then we will print it smaller. Finally, if none of the previous conditions are true, we'll fall back to the else statement, which will just print the text, who knows. The if-else statements in PHP have a couple of syntax variations that you'll frequently run into in Drupal themes. The first is a colon notation, where again, the logic is the same. We're saying if A is equal to B, then print its equal. Otherwise, end the statement. The nice thing about this syntax that we'll see frequently in themes is that we can break this syntax up and include some markup in the middle. We'll see examples of that in most template files. The other variation that we'll see is a nice shorthand if you just have a small conditional that you want to only take up one line. In this syntax, we have our action first, so print is what we want to ultimately do with the value. Then we have our conditional, so if this evaluates to true, then we want to print the part after the question mark. If the conditional is not true, then our else statement is signified by the colon. So what this conditional is doing is if A is equal to B, then it'll print its equal, otherwise it will print nothing. A slightly more complicated version of this conditional is the switch statement. This is something we'll also see in template.php files from time to time. Essentially, switch is a shorthand for very long if and else if statements. In this example here, we're going to switch our cases based on the value of the time of day variable. And what the switch statement is going to do is, based on the value of that variable, it's going to look for matching cases. So in the first block we have the case morning. So if time of day is equal to morning, then it'll print eat breakfast. The second case is of afternoon. So if time of day is not equal to morning, then it'll move on and check to see if time of day is equal to afternoon. If that's true, then it'll print lunchtime. Finally, much like an else clause, if none of the previous conditions evaluate, then the default syntax can be used, in which case it'll just print z's. Important to note in switch statements is that you can have multiple cases that may match, which is why we make use of the break statement. So if we want only morning to be applied, we will break after the print eat breakfast. Now let's talk about loops. We use loops in PHP when we want to execute a certain segment of code multiple times in a row. Just like conditional statements, loops have a couple different syntax variations in PHP. The first of these is known as a while loop. In a while loop, we're going to have a single condition that will be checked on each iteration of the loop, whether or not the condition still evaluates to true. So in our example here, we have a simple counter variable called I, and as we go through the loop, each iteration through the loop, the condition is going to be checked to see if I is still less than 10. If that's true, then it'll execute the code that will print Lullabot loves you, followed by a shorthand for incrementing the value of I. So on the first run, I will be equal to 0, which is in fact less than 10, so Lullabot loves you will print, and then I's value will be updated to 1. PHP will then return to the top, check to see that I is still less than 10, and continue. The result will be that Lullabot loves you will be printed 10 times in a row. This same structure has an alternate syntax known as a for loop. In for loops, we get a special sort of condition that has 3 parts separated by semicolons. The first is that initial condition, which is I equals 0, followed by the conditional, or the test to check to see if it's still true, followed by a statement to increment the counter generally. So this for loop functions in the exact same way as the previous while loop. Our I counter begins at 0, and each iteration through the loop is updated by 1 until it is equal to 10. So we get the exact same result. Lullabot loves you is printed 10 times. The final variation on looping syntax is known as for each. For each is handy if we have an array full of items that we want to execute some code on each element in the array. So in this example, we're going to loop through our stuff array and print each item in that array. So if we recall our original stuff array, we'll get stingray printed by telescope. We can clean this up slightly and add in a BR tag, for example, and that'll change our output to be stingray and telescope. Finally, we'd like to talk about functions. As we get into more advanced theming topics, we're going to be writing a lot of functions to implement certain hooks inside of Drupal's theme system. Let's have a look at how they're constructed in PHP. Functions in PHP are used to encapsulate frequently repeated tasks. We'll be writing lots of functions as we start to override Drupal theme functions and implement pre-process hooks. The structure of a function begins with the word function, so that we know we're beginning a new function declaration. Then we give a name to our function, in this case my underscore function, and then we pass in a list of parameters, which will be the input values to our function. In the case of this example, we have the variable a and b. Finally, a function can optionally have a return value that it provides as output. In this case, we'll be outputting the value of the variable c. There's a couple interesting things to note when working with functions. First off, we can pass any values into the a and b parameters. They can be variables that aren't named a or b, or static values. The other thing to note is that we can have variables that exist only inside the scope of our function, such as the variable c here. The variable c only exists inside the execution of my function. Let's have a look at how our example function will behave when used. At the bottom here we have a variable x that we're setting equal to 4, and then calling print my function with the variable x passed as the first parameter and the number 6 passed as the second parameter. Inside of my function's call now, the variable a will be equal to the variable x, which is going to be the value of 4. The parameter b will be equal to the number 6. So we'll see that c is going to get set to 4 plus 6, which is 10, and then that value will be returned. So the result of print my function will be the number 10. Also inside of our function, we have the value of a being set to a plus 1. So inside of the function, the value of a will be 5. However, that a variable only exists inside the scope of our function. Thus, when we print x after our function call, it's still equal to the number 4. In PHP, we can also pass parameters by reference. We can see this in the syntax by the addition of the ampersand before the parameter a. This will change the behavior of our function slightly when called. If we look at our previous example again, where we have the variable x equal to 4, the first print statement that's printing the result of my function will still be 4 plus 6, which is the value of c. So it'll still print 10. However, because our x variable has now been passed by reference, any changes that happen inside the body of our function will actually persist after the call has been made. So when we take x and refer to it as a inside of the function, and we do a equals a plus 1, that will actually change the value of the x variable from the calling scope. So when we print the x variable after the call to my function, that variable will now print out the value 5. While we don't have time in this video to cover everything that there is to know about PHP, we hope a few of these simple pointers will help make some of the code that we'll be looking at later make a little bit more sense to those of you who are newer to PHP. If you're looking for more information or want to learn more about PHP, php.net is a great resource that fully documents the entire language.